You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I'm the founder of a company called Systemic Innovation. We've worked across the world doing very different types of innovation, system change types projects. What we're seeing is that few firms who are actually scaling and growing, despite tremendous support being on offer. How do you bring public and private actors together in ways that enable better coordination and collaboration? Ultimately, scaling is not about how big a company goes as such. It matters is how an organization changes as it grows. And I think this huge opportunity over the next 10, 20 years. The rise of Africa will surprise a lot of people.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Scott Walker, who is CEO and founder of Systemic Innovation, which is a systems change innovation practice solving wicked systematic challenges through a collective intelligence model that connects people, ideas and insights. Welcome to the podcast, Scott. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I like to start from the beginning. So tell us a bit more about Scott Walker.
Sure. So I'm the founder of a company called Systemic Innovation. We've worked across the world doing very different types of innovation, system change types projects. Last 10 years or so, done a lot of work in Africa, very different types of projects in East, West, South Africa, often at the interface of looking at government challenges, looking at the entrepreneurship ecosystem, seeing how certain new interventions can make the system work better for improved development outcomes.
So you mentioned that you've worked across the world, focused on Africa for the last 10 years. So what was the inspiration or idea behind starting Systemic Innovation?
So Systemic has almost been a combination of the network that I've built up over the years and looking to see how different projects could be developed that attack really intractable, wicked, sticky problems. And by bringing in people that I've worked with over the course of my career, the right people at the right time for the right types of projects is a different type of consultancy model. And so be fortunate enough to work with a variety of different clients, which governments and private companies, in order to help them think about what is the change they want to affect and, importantly, ways in which they can do it that is perhaps not traditional, but allows thinking about what is the proper diagnostics. How do you then bring policy or way of approaching a problem that then leads to a coherent set of actions, interventions, but more importantly, it's not here's what we think should do. Innovation, the hard yards is really rolling up your sleeves and helping implement that type of change. And so what we try and do is offer a full service, starting with helping understand what the problem is, through to try and solve that problem. And often the projects we have are long-term projects. They're not short one-off things. System change requires a longer commitment. And, it's hard, it's difficult, it takes time, but it's the right way that we believe that we need to think about change as opposed to the more episodic or ephemeral, thin actions. You need a long-term view and sustained effort over a period of time to make change happen.
So you mentioned that Systemic Innovation came about through the network that you built over the years. So given the interconnected nature of your work, I was wondering if we could go into greater detail in terms of how you approach solving these systemic challenges through the intelligence model that you have that connects people, ideas, and insights.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I think that ultimately to think through different types of challenges, we need a range of different perspectives and people with experience who've done different things over the course of their career that, ultimately the goal is to see how one can draw from that pool of the network that I've been fortunate enough to develop over the course of 25 years and find individuals who are the right or well placed, who've got experience which is adjacent or relevant to certain types of projects, and see, often it's not necessarily available, but attract them into certain projects. That allows diversity of thought, finding a kind of having a collective, as it were, a pool in which we can bring in top talent that can help an organization think through things in ways which, as I said, is not necessarily traditional. That by having this fortunate network, we're able to pull together a team that is with global experience, but most importantly works with local players, so we understand, in effect, what's going on the ground. And it's the combination of those things which I think are really, really important. The other thing to add is, obviously, when working in particular in Africa, having local partners really, really matters. So, we would not attempt to be kind of, say, operational and having local partners that can help solve with us and work with us allows a transference of knowledge and, local insights, which are also appreciated and particularly useful to getting things done. So it's almost, looking at kind of global expertise with local partnerships, local insight. It's the combination of those things which actually is really, really valuable.
Brilliant. So I guess looking at this from a Africa perspective, a piece of work that you published mentions that African scale-ups are born global. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this and potentially the challenges that African scale-ups do face when expanding across multiple countries.
Yeah, so I think almost let's give some context to it. A couple of years ago, having seen kind of a significant amount of activity in support of African firms looking to kind of grow and scale, what we're seeing is that few firms who are actually scaling and growing, despite tremendous support being on offer. And I think when looking at the evidence and the data and the research, it wasn't possible to actually really understand this from a systems perspective, how these different kind of challenges, impediments, barriers, how do they relate to one another? So if there's a problem in one space, how does it affect an attempt to expand internationally? And so we managed to get some funding from the UK government to do a piece of research work called Scaling in Africa. That was a full systems examination of the different context barriers, pathways that would help firms scale and grow. Ultimately, scaling is one of those words which is really often used but not particularly well understood. So our goal was to ask, can we put much more precision around what scaling is, what it isn't? Expansion and growth to other territories is something which is really relevant in Africa, because ultimately, even though there are large populations, actually they're reasonably small markets in terms of consumers that are able to afford and pay. And therefore, what we find is basically companies are looking to grow and expand. They often need to kind of internationalize early. And that brings with it a whole range of complexity to a business very early on in its life. And I think that one of the challenges is working out, if one is to expand and attempt to cross borders, it is particularly difficult in 54 different countries, very different languages, different contexts, different systems. Scaling and growing is hard enough, but in Africa, it's particularly difficult due to a range of different, fundamentals around enabling business environments, regulations, currency, controls, other factors that just makes growing a business harder. But in particular, when expanding to other countries, it is particularly difficult because of the nature of the markets and the emergent structures, foundations, legal enablers that allow that expansion to happen easily, smoothly, quickly, and also at low cost, given large populations, but actually reasonably small markets. So that's one of the areas in which we investigated as part of our Scaling in Africa thesis, along with, say, a number of different areas around the ecosystem itself, looking at growth and management strategies, looking at talent, looking at investors. We tried to look across the piece and say, how do all of these things kind of connect? And what is the evidence and data that allows us to start to really understand scaling from a more scientific perspective, noting that scaling is always going to be an art. It'll always be, some founders which have, huge motivation, experience that can actually move up the curve, but it isn't easy. And our assessment is in Africa, it's even more difficult and it takes longer to scale. And therefore, should we rethink about basically what is needed, given the fact that the data tells us it is different? What do we need to do to change the way that we provide support, given the data and what that tells us?
Yeah, so you mentioned that you identified a few firms were actually scaling and growing. So when it comes to scaling ventures, what would you say are the factors entrepreneurs should consider in deciding between, say, a global, regional, or local approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. As part of one of the sections of our report, which is the africanscalepath.com, we look at kind of international growth plays. So in terms of basically whether, because African scale-ups are almost forced to be kind of born global, what do they need to do in terms of predicting where they should go, how they should go about it, having a playbook, as it were, so they can actually start to repeat and replicate certain activities. There's not a great deal of evidence and literature around kind of international activities of scale-ups in Africa, but we know that going across markets is really hard because of the complexities and the costs associated in each of those different markets. And so for each company, it's them asking what is their particular strategy that they want to decide, and that will determine basically the speed, scale, and the scope of their internationalizations. And ultimately, each company will be different about basically what they do and how they approach it. We made a number of different suggestions, which factors that should be considered when prioritizing basically whether they should stage expansion plans. I think there are 10 different factors in our report around, just avoiding uniformity. Each industry and market dynamic is going to be different as it's developing products and services to localize. And ultimately, it works here, it will work there, doesn't necessarily exist. The lick and stick or cut and paste model potentially has its limitations. I think there's necessary to take a lot of due diligence, research around basically what you're planning, and you can kind of anticipate some of those hurdles in advance. So market and consumer research is obviously clear. Planning out what your strategy should be, understanding different local factors, being able to kind of talk to a lot of people to still triangulate the truth and check the evidence and advice. How quickly and often you should move from one to the other, I think it will always be dependent on the business, but getting one country right before you get to the next one, I think is probably decent advice. And it's also finding right local partners to work with to lead the process. It is not easy. Having the right partners, the right networks, building out kind of institutional memories. So when we do it, you understand basically what's worked, why it's not being successful, kind of being able to document that, I think is really, really important. So I think there are some organizations that can really help that process. The work, when you point to Endeavour as having kind of really strong networks and local support, good lawyers, good accountants, good people they can put people in touch with, those things are really, really important. And so, it's not easy, but there is assistance and support for businesses at, I guess, the more mature end. But when you're at a very early stage, the hope is, we can move, we can grow really quickly. But actually what you would do is you end up adding much more complexity. And that is, especially for a business working already in challenging conditions, that can sometimes really buckle or be problematic for a business, I think, because it introduces a lot of complexity very early on in the business. And that is always quite unique for Africa, having to kind of expand early. And given the other complexities of running a fully operational scaling business in Africa, it just adds more challenge at a certain time in the business. And there is almost a note of caution before going ahead and doing that. But businesses need to expand and gain customers. So there's a paradox there that exists, and it's not easy necessarily to find a straight line.
So would you say that these are possibly the most predictable expansion pain points that African scale-ups encounter? And I guess if so, how would you say they could be addressed or prevented?
Yeah, I mean, say there were some things which are predictable and other things which there's the uncertainties around it, particularly when it comes to kind of government or policy or other factors. I think we're seeing a degree of recognition that getting the enabling environment and attracting as part of kind of foreign direct investment, countries are starting to understand that this is important. I think, aspects around improving visas, just to allow travel, enabling conditions. Ultimately, if you look at the way that the EU stabilized over time, it took a number of years, right away from the Single Market Act, in the 1980s through to basically a number of different provisions that allowed increased free movement of people, of services that enable trade. And I think that you're going to see that this infrastructure being started with ACTA, but I think that these things just take time, and in particular in emergent markets where there's lots of uncertainty and other factors and things are perhaps less predictable, means that there will be more of a challenge and more the business needs to be somewhat adaptive, and that requires a certain agility in the business to enable itself to react to change. And that's really important because it isn't static, and you're working in environments which are challenging for different reasons. Especially if you're looking to build out infrastructure, it requires real understanding in terms of what's happening locally, having local partners which are strong, other aspects that will be really important. And you're also facing competition from either local incumbents or from others who have also foreseen a market opportunity. So it doesn't make it easy to expand out, and especially early on, as I mentioned.
You touched on a key point regarding creating an enabling environment and how the EU stabilized. So if we look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, what specific challenges do you think businesses face in navigating, say, for instance, regulatory frameworks, dealing with trade, foreign exchange, and just a general starting and running a business?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are system structural barriers, whether it be these complex regulatory frameworks, whether it be certain barriers to entry, certain incumbent monopolies that already exist. I think that there is a flurry of kind of pro-business continental kind of multilateral agreements that are, would be African continental free trade and national legislation and other kind of startup acts which are kind of coming into play. And I think that's really, really important in terms of setting the right environment. I think that only a very small amount of trade was intra-African trade, only 17 or so%. So
yes.
You're coming against a very historically a challenging environment where it's difficult to trade within the borders to your neighbours, as it were. And I think that policy alone is one part, but it also needs the enabling environment in terms of being able to register a business at a low cost, that business process being kind of not cumbersome and not taking an extraordinary amount of time, having kind of hidden costs or other corruption issues that basically prevent or don't enable those active provisions to work at an operational level. And that's one of the challenges, basically. And I think there's quite a lot of work that's still needed to create the kind of right enabling environment to allow or help ventures to scale into new markets. I think that ultimately there are still bottlenecks. And I think if you look at some of the early evaluation work in terms of the indexing work, in terms of how things are going, there is still, the private sector still has a negative perception around trading goods, which is a bit odd, but ultimately suggests more work needs to be done to remove, tariff, non-tariff barriers, allow data engagement with the private sector, business associations. So reliance on policy and legislation and government communications alone isn't enough. And I think you also need facilitated market and systems innovation to basically make it work. Ultimately, regulation is complex, it's costly, it's inconsistent across all of the different countries. And I think that there are major issues, whether it be looking across tax departments, exchange controls that exist, there's local currency depreciation that happens. So we end up basically having kind of a very messy system. And I think ultimately much more work is needed to kind of just continuously push, what is an enabling environment at a policy level and also an operational level to allow firms to basically get on and do what they need to do in terms of grow. And that's where the role of an entrepreneurial state can be particularly beneficial, right? The government should be setting the conditions, putting in place kind of strategies that enable not just startup acts, which they are important, but actually from a more practical sense, what are they doing to ensure policy levers, convening, and other activities can be put in place to allow the operating environment to be conducive as possible.
Yeah, I agree. So for organizations that have a remit to enact, say, after, how do you believe they can contribute to a clear strategic implementation that supports scaling ventures in Africa?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. Can we collect data around certain firm level dynamics? I think that's something which is invariably missing, but is really important. So we can see what are the individual and firm level traits to make possible to actually really understand kind of what's going on the ground. I think that's something which has been kind of missed, as it were. I think we still need more public deliberation and debate around basically what is needed in these different areas in order to support, whether it be areas to help, like policy, when it comes to improving reforms to labour laws, or how do you put in place kind of quality innovation infrastructure? What does that look like? I think that there is examples in Africa where there's been efforts, such as in Botswana, as a Ministry of Entrepreneurship, where you get really high-level commitments. I think the work that's been done in Rwanda is really pioneering, and you see a government that really kind of has put innovation at the heart of its agenda, and a lot of activity, a lot of thinking to kind of top down is a good example of when a government is taking it seriously. Now, Rwanda's a unique case because they don't have very many scaling firms, and they are positioning themselves almost as a launch pad for other firms to, in effect, pilot and then scale once they've started in Rwanda. I think it's an interesting strategy. But what it shows is basically that the government has if you're serious about innovation and enabling a growth environment, you've got to put the resources, investment, and infrastructure in place. And that's really pleasing to see, because there are not many examples I can think of in Africa where you've got such a concerted effort to use the weapon of innovation to help that country move up the gears, in effect, to become and have a long-term vision, 2050 vision about basically where it wants to go and to move towards becoming a more high-income country. So, I think it's a good example, and others can follow, basically looking at it from trying to make good bets and put in place structures that will enable, firms to grow because the environment is healthier and more conducive.
Yeah. You've given a great example of the work done in Rwanda to support innovation. So from your opinion, what role do you believe governments play in enabling or hindering innovation and scaling ventures?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I would say that I have a kind of background in government public affairs, but ultimately, I think we're looking at it from a place where there's typically been an underinvestment in innovation across Africa. There is no doubt about that. If you look at the overall kind of contributions in terms of overall investment spend, GDP as a percentage towards innovation is really very low. So first of all, the first thing to point to make is they're playing catch up massively when other countries are investing far more and have historically kind of already got a head start. So actually, historically, Africa is falling behind, even though that's uncomfortable to hear, but that's the truth. If you look at kind of the innovation index and look at its relative ranking, but we're not necessarily seeing kind of, this is a global competition. And so governments need to take this stuff seriously and should be committing more towards innovation, improving their national systems of innovation and their role as ecosystem support catalysts, right? They are the enablers that will allow companies to grow, flourish, and also be attracted to work in those particular countries. So, to what extent they are important, I think it is vital. I can't underscore it enough. And I think that ultimately it happens at multiple different levels. What should they be doing? I think the development around hubs is great, but I think let's start from a question about, can you create an optimally kind of calibrated innovation ecosystem, right? Does that mean getting better performance frameworks in place so you can understand basically, coordinate certain government incentives or programs that work with actors to help them achieve common goals under clear defined metrics? Can you monitor and evaluate different actions to say basically what is working or not? Typically, there isn't a performance framework in place, right? So you end up with lack of monitoring evaluation in terms of what's working, why, which is really problematic. You've got a lot of activity, but it's just activity. It's all, you see a lot of outputs, not necessarily outcomes, and not necessarily then following up to impact, because we're just doing activity. We're not basically understanding whether it's working or not. And I think there's a real knowledge gap around trying to understand what efforts are actually attributable or contributing towards success or not. And that's really problematic, because you end up basically not having knowledge or lessons learned around best practice, what's happening, how do you connect basically the innovation systems to new technologies or markets outside borders. You end up basically with more guesswork as opposed to designing in a way that you say, this is going to give us more optimal results. So how do you get different actors working in sync? How do you collaborate in a way that understand what an ecosystem is, what it's not, what it's missing? Once you've got a better frame, then you can basically start to work out how to put in place certain frameworks, targets and other things, so you can coordinate, incentivize, make sure that you create a system whereby certain companies almost incentivize to create market or opportunities that allow certain economic or social challenges to be solved. And that, for me, the thing that's really interesting is not just about kind of growing companies for the sake of allowing kind of growth at all costs. It's you want a way that you are collaborating in ecosystems, so you're solving social human development goals, right? And that's where you should be targeting. But if you don't actually measure any of this stuff, if you're not targeted around basically what outcomes you actually want and directing and shaping the ecosystem, then what can you expect as a result? It's a free-for-all, right? It's very messy. And I think that can you play a role in deciding, dictating, or helping certain outcomes? Of course you can. So government's role is to basically to put in place certain visions, set the environment and incentivize and convene the right people together and get us a system in place that allows entrepreneurship to flourish in the right way.
Looking at it from a different direction, given the complexity of regulatory frameworks, what can be done to streamline the process and possibly make it more attractive for foreign direct investment that can support innovation and scaling ventures in African countries?
Well, big question. I think that when it comes to regulation, and I've spent some time in a regulated environment, and regulation is quite complicated. Ultimately, both entrepreneurs and investors want certainty, right? When entering into markets, they need processes that are almost cooperative, that have a degree of transparency, that are somewhat standardized. We have kind of clear timelines to decision makers so they can be held to account. That allows businesses basically to plan and allocate resources, right? And so if your regulatory requirements are not those things and are uncertain, then it's problematic. And when you end up with a situation where different countries differ, and sometimes really quite wildly differ from one another, even regions, it is more difficult. You get to open a company, harder to get a visa, a bank account, whatever it might be. And ultimately, it depends. Regulation is a very broad word, but it depends on which vertical you're working in. So ultimately, there's different complexities that are involved and costs in different markets. If you require certain licenses or agency agreements, customs clearance, banking, regulatory approvals, whatever it might be, and those compliance requirements basically increase cost and reduce competitiveness. So one of the comments that we had from our interviews when we did our initial research was that ultimately regulators can be a bit reckless in Africa. And I think that avoiding these kind of policy somersaults and having certainty is really, really important. There's been some good work being done. UK Tech Hub did an online kind of business regulatory toolkit which helped businesses kind of navigate the environment at different stages of development. But that's one toe in the water, as it were. and various different countries who kind of to adopt supportive mechanisms and direct attention in ways to say, how can we make our environment attractive to businesses that are coming in? I think, the examples elsewhere in the world where that's worked quite well. I think innovation agencies within those countries basically have a role in terms of basically trying to create that type of environment. I think that look at regulation, right? The question is, it's quite complicated, but it's basically, it doesn't happen before or after the event. And so understanding kind of when to regulate and when not to is something which regulators themselves will always, sometimes you have to let the market happen and then regulate after as opposed to before, which stifles and stymies the market. And I think, there's lots of talk about kind of, let's put in regulatory sandboxes and these things, but ultimately they are not necessarily proven and they're not a panacea. What you want is basically, going back to what the UK government has around kind of its own principles around what regulation should be. It should be targeted, it should be proportionate, it should be, accountable, transparent. All those things basically help a market and the actors working within it. And I think that there's still some work to do. Let's put it like that.
Yes. So in an ideal scenario, how would you envision the collaboration between the public and private sector to create an enabling environment that is helpful to the growth of businesses or scaling ventures in Africa?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think that, how do you bring kind of public and private actors together in ways that enable better coordination and collaboration, right? And at so many different levels, there isn't necessarily a partnership or collaboration happening. I think there's a lot of rhetoric. A lot of people talk about collaboration, but actually don't walk the walk as far as actually finding themselves developing kind of partnerships which are kind of mutually beneficial. There's a lot of, it's a little bit more zero sum. What's in it for me at the expense of others? Collaboration is something which takes time, and it is something that's sometimes earned. And I think that there's still ways in which collaboration can be incentivized better. I think there are examples of public-private actors coming together to support the ecosystem. I think there is examples of those kind of hybrid approaches when you look at kind of the way that entrepreneurship support organizations, which ultimately are private organizations but working in a public interest, are playing in ways that allow for this kind of mutual win-win. Is that happening enough? I think in terms of, successful partnerships, I think there's, with all these things, I think there's a lot of learnings. Of course, more can be done, but I think we're seeing progress in terms of different actors coming together and cooperating in ways that perhaps they weren't. I think there is still ways in which, say, academics can do more and have a public interest, and the private sector could work better with academia. And I don't think that's happening enough. And it's a way in which those types of collaborations are forged, will be more beneficial going forward. Ultimately, this collaboration is still fragmented. It requires kind of mindset shifts in order to allow for more dynamic, aggregated, informed networks and partnerships that allows us to be more integrated around sort of what is the planning and possibilities that allow an alignment between those different partners. And I think that when you have kind of quite disparate or non-cohesive efforts, you end up being quite shallow in terms of what those partnerships are. And the more you can move towards, having a deeper level of partnership, much more open, that it's structured, that it's ongoing, it's sustained, that you've aligned those incentives, then that would be beneficial. But I think that we still see the ecosystem as emergent, and these things can sometimes take time, but it requires concerted efforts to, as in any partnership, to allow a partnership to work. And that's understanding the needs of different parties, being able to allow or support how those needs are solved and helped. And I think these things just sometimes take time and resources in order to point in the right direction.
Thank you for that, Scott. We've spoken about government and investors. If we look at it from the perspective of the entrepreneur, this is a very open question. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs who are looking to enter the African market and scale their ventures successfully?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm extremely positive about the opportunities in Africa, and I think that it's so vibrant. I think there's incredible talent, and there's huge opportunities which await. I think there's also management expectations around it is not necessarily simple and easy. I think that there are challenges in terms of understanding what is the contextual environment in which you're kind of working in. The advice I give, I mean, yes, people look at Africa and say, oh, look, 1.4 billion people, huge markets, but actually these markets are large but are highly fragmented and diverse in terms of language, cultural norms, all those other aspects. And you need a large market. So that's the first thing, kind of to identify that. But even within that, look about what is an addressable market. I think that there is challenges with respect to the income levels are low. The low internet penetration is improving, and there are other constraints that actually makes it more difficult. You see large markets, but actually, consumers are price sensitive, limited purchasing power, and I think that that's a challenge. So look at addressing or solving kind of big problems. I think that's where I would always put an encouragement. Look at defining what actually is a kind of scalable model. I think that's critical. I think do your diligence around basically what is your unique point, competitive edge, as it were, that technology or unique skill or whatever privileged relationship, what do you have that is distinct and different? I think there's huge opportunities to do impact work because of just the nature of the markets you're operating in. And, ultimately be, laser focused on what your customer needs. Provide a way that solves a real and urgent need better than what's out there, that delights your customers, collect feedback, focus on solving their pain points, solutions that actually really work for them is always going to be core to any business function. And it's easy to forget, but it is essential. So, very optimistic around the possibilities. It isn't easy, but what has always impressed me about African entrepreneurs is their incredible resilience and their ability to solve when challenges are, in fact, systems, structures, infrastructure are against them, yet they still can be very successful. So, hats off to those which have made progress, because I think it's incredibly impressive. And I think there's huge opportunity that over the next 10, 20 years, the rise of Africa will surprise a lot of people.
So if we can go into those points in more detail, in your view, what do you believe are the key success factors for scaling ventures that are operating in Africa?
There's a number of different ways in which, there are certain attributes we can point to in terms of, ways in which kind of those scaling founders have done or approached things in certain ways. For Africa, I think you see there isn't a playbook, there isn't precedent. You're setting your own direction on the ground. And I think that being adaptive and wayfinder, as it were, is really, really important because, it hasn't been done and you're setting new ground and territory. I think that being able to anticipate and to be, early internationalists, as it were, to have an international kind of outlook expansion is going to be important because of just the nature of the market. So for a lot of the markets are actually small, or the ones which are large are actually, highly competitive. I think that, what's really interesting in Africa is those founders which are building infrastructure, whether it be a kind of vertical or horizon stacks that lay pathways that governments and necessarily fail to build. So in effect, there's a new generation of type of startup. They're building the infrastructure as well as the business. And that's super interesting because it allows, see examples of some of those successful businesses being able to build off very different revenue streams that result of basically be a logistics business or other aspects, which basically didn't intend to, but as a result of being able to create new markets. And I think that makes it really, really, really interesting because there's an adaptability which you don't necessarily see that in other markets. And that's very exciting. I think there is limited kind of, experience when it comes to kind of the mechanics of operating in a growth business in Africa. There just aren't enough. And I think that there's a lot of people who are kind of still working it out in terms of how to do that. And I think that there is a need for more successful entrepreneurs. That is important. And I think there is fantastic talent in Africa, but we don't see kind of experienced talent. There is a shallow pool. And I think that the support that is provided, pulling into the right networks, getting advice from people who have been there, done it, investors and give guidance, et cetera, is really, really important, because the kind of institutional know-how of what to do, real life experience matters. And I think that being undercapitalized and neglected traditionally by kind of finances or institutional finance means that you need to bootstrap it pretty much. So I think those are kind of some attributes of founders. Some of the things I see in terms of basically those entrepreneurs that are being successful because they're doing it in ways that are required because of the environments they're working in are different to, say, the ones in North America or in Europe.
Thank you for that. So if we look at these factors and maybe the trends that they create, are there any current trends that you're seeing with regards to how African ventures are currently successfully scaling?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think that there's a clear trend at the moment is basically there's less money available. And so the focus always comes down to building a business which is back to basics in terms of understanding, you can't be reliant on external funding, and therefore focusing around kind of the basics around, unit economics, making sure the business is basically operating effectively, system structures, process, all those, all operational factors is clearly something which is, I see that trend because of the environment. I think some recognition, and I see where there will be kind of more activity going forward, is to start to really understand firm dynamics from a data perspective much better. And I think one of the things which has been not unsurprising, especially given there hasn't been a lot of funding historically coming into Africa, now more money, is that a lot of people very much focus on investment rounds, how much one has raised, and thinking that is a signal to the ecosystem as to basically scaling. It's not, because how much you've raised is not going to necessarily relate to the traction and whether you actually spend that money in a way that actually affords or allows you to grow. And I think that given there's less money around, I think that there will be an increasing need and a trend towards basically looking at firm dynamics. So understanding what's really going on below the surface of that particular venture. Ultimately scaling, it's not about how big a company goes as such. It really matters is basically how an organization changes as it grows. So as it starts to move from a startup towards an enterprise, that we put in place systems, structures, the organizational leadership that allows that change to transition towards maturity to occur. And I think, there'll be an increasing need to look at data around that. What are those firm dynamics? And I think that that's overdue. So we move away from the headline X has raised X amount. What does that actually mean? What is the performance of that firm? So they move towards profitability, not just growth as such.
Fantastic. So if we move from current trends and look at the future, in your opinion, what will the African venture scaling space look like in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily into predictions, but I think there's a few different things. One is the support that's on offer from around scaling should improve, and that's the hope. There's a lot of help out there at incubation acceleration, but it's not necessarily scaling support. And I would expect an increasing demand for expert scale-up support. People put scaling in their, marketing, but I think we move away from more standardized kind of just incubation offerings towards much deeper dive, customizable support being provided by experts. And I see that being something where we'd see more effort around, thinking around certain aspects which are missing around, say, governance, around professionalizing teams and optimizing systems, process, production. Those are things that's really, really important. And I think that, the right type of scaling support is often it's expensive due to its bespoke nature, but I see that being something as more important. And I expect that there will be more nuance and more specifics around basically what that kind of support that is offered to firms being offered into the market. It's something which I've seen in other countries where you have different kind of categorization for kind of business support services. And I think I would expect to see some maturity around the market in terms of various different things being offered, that you'll get more segmentation around the type of support. I'd also expect going forward, and the work that we're doing is to start to shine a clearer light on data. And that's, as I say, looking much beyond investment data to really understand firm dynamics, what's working, what's not. I'd expect aspects around performance frameworks to be thought through in terms of basically how you incentivize different support actors in different ways. I think there's a maturity that can happen. Ultimately, does that then lead to a kind of slightly more of a pay for results basis and slightly clearer targets set by sort of government or other actors, so you can focus on job creation priorities potentially, hopefully. And I think that we can expect to see some maturity. There's a lot of activity, but I think ultimately it should become clearer, particularly using data in terms of basically who's performing well. If you can shine more transparency into that and more reporting and accountability, then I think gradually you get towards a more professional, more mature ecosystem. And that's something which I would hope to see. If that's something which is a trend or predictable, I like to be optimistic. I'd like to see that being the trajectory and direction of travel.
If we look closer to home, I know you've slightly touched on this, but where do you see yourself in systemic innovation in 5 years' time? How will you be supporting scaling ventures in Africa?
We've been fortunate enough to have some great projects working with the UK government at the moment around a project in a range of different countries in East Africa. I think that in some ways just getting going with that around building the foundations for understanding kind of what data is needed, what that looks like, working with governments and other partners around what is an enabling environment. I think there is an opportunity to think about this at a Pan-African level. I think that, there's lots of pockets of examples of activity and good things which are taking place. And I think there is a role or function to develop some knowledge or resource which builds on, I guess, the African work that we've done and starts to operationalize that in ways that allows access to information, support in ways that is not on offer, but should be. And I think by coordinating a number of different actors around shared goals is something which I think is definitely of interest. Whether we can generate enough support and coordination around that, I think that's something which I would like to be involved in. I've been working around Africa since 2006, nearly 18 years. So I don't plan on going anywhere. I think that in some ways we're just getting going with some of these activities and always open to, as you should be in innovation, to serendipity and uncertain things coming onto one's desk. I think that keeps us on our toes and very much open-minded to new ways in which we can do work that really genuinely tries to create impact, doing things in ways that haven't necessarily been done, that attacks the challenges that are seen to be hard to tackle, but others don't want to go to, and to do it whilst enjoying it. As long as that's happening, then I don't see a direction of travel, as it were, to be any different.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Last question. It's a bit different to the rest of the questions, Scott.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I think my own hope and ambition is to just keep doing work which I enjoy which is challenging, with people that I'm learning from, and to try and improve every day. That's my own mantra. And I think if I'm inconsistent with that, then I should go and do something else. But at the moment, I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I'm still very much relishing. I wake up every day. I'm excited to get on and do my work. I'm never bored. Fortunate enough to work with great people. And may long that continue.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And it's definitely a great way to go by day and looking into the future. As we've come to the end of today's conversation, I was wondering if you had any closing remarks, any final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, look, I think we take the approach of working very openly. Everything we do, always happy to help share information, and we're very transparent around the work we're doing, especially with government and around data. More than happy to reach out. I always take the view that if I can help, I will. If people want to reach out and chat, I'm always very, very open to those conversations and would be, more than happy to facilitate wherever I can. Congratulations for you for one, I think, being a LinkedIn voice influencer, and you've got a new categorization, if I'm not mistaken, which I think is well deserved. I think what you're doing is great. I think giving people the opportunity to say a few words and to facilitate this is really welcome. So, thanks to you for inviting me, and I look forward to catching up in person, hopefully at some point in the not too distant future.
Definitely, Scott. Thank you for joining us on the podcast and discussing the complexities of scaling ventures in Africa and how you're going about addressing the systemic challenges through innovative intelligence models. So yes, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, and we will speak soon.
Great, it's been my pleasure. Thank you, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. Speak soon.
Thanks, buddy. See you.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.